What's going on, everyone? Today is the 7th of November, 2023, and welcome back to this, the 63rd edition of the Superstream. My name is Derek, author and webmaster of Gematrinator.com, and today we're going to look at the last week in news and sports and talk about the language of numerology and how a lot of these events in the media are synced up together, particularly with the 9/11 theme that I've been talking about so often this year. Shout out to everybody who's watching live in the comments. As far as things getting deleted and disappearing, I really don't know what to tell you. This channel has been squashed by YouTube in several ways, and oftentimes comments from people that I try interacting with are just deleted from the channel. It's got nothing to do with me. I don't really delete comments. I can't say I've never deleted one, but not something I really look to do. So if you want to interact more with the community, try checking out the Discord link down in the description below. Down in the description, you'll also find a link to the blog, and that's what we'll be looking at today, several of my blog posts from the last week. And these are the stories we'll look at today. It's not as many as normal, but a couple of these are pretty meaty decodes. We're going to kick things off by talking about the death of famous college basketball coach Bob Knight at the age of 83. On Thursday Night Football this week, the Pittsburgh Steelers picked up their 666th victory of all time during the regular season. And we're going to talk about how that syncs up to the death of Adam Johnson, who played NHL hockey in Pittsburgh. That's the man who died in England during a game against the Sheffield Steelers last weekend. Speaking of the NFL, we had our Game of the Year candidate last Sunday, Buccaneers and Texans. And we're going to talk about the numerology of that game, as well as the unlikely field goal by Dare Ogunbowale in that game. The Texas Rangers won their first World Series championship. We'll dive deep into that. And then finally, we'll look at the Beatles. Now and Then was their final single released just a few days ago. And we'll talk a lot about the numerology of that. And if we have some time, we're going to dig a little bit into this Aaron Rodgers riddle, potentially making a comeback for the Jets, as I do find Week 13 to be a very, very intriguing date for Rodgers to return. If you're new to the channel, we talk about numerology with a strong emphasis on the language of Gematria, the ancient number lettering system. This is a mystical practice, and it provides a different perception on the reality that we all experience. This ordinal cipher can then be reduced into a cipher called Pythagorean, where every double-digit number gets dropped to a single digit. Our Gematria ciphers can also be reversed to produce a couple of complementary ciphers. Another important method we'll be looking at is the standard method of Gematria, a denary cipher, which is structured identically to the ancient Hebrew and Greek Gematria and isopsephy charts. However, the most important method in Gematria, as I say in every video, is this Latin or Agrippa's key method, which has the same numerical structure but uses the order of the ancient Latin alphabet. And to this very day, this seems to be more significant than I think any of us really realize yet. So we'll kick things off by talking about Bobby Knight, the famous longtime Indiana Hoosiers coach, also a coach for Army and Texas Tech, passing away at the age of 83. Now, when Bob Knight retired, he had the most victories in the history of college basketball, with 902. And the bulk of his career he spent coaching for the Indiana Hoosiers men's basketball team. Well, notice how in the language of Gematria, Indiana Hoosiers men's basketball equals 902, the total number of wins he retired with. Furthermore, Indiana Hoosiers in our reduction cipher sums to 92 in reverse. And this presents an important idea about numerology, is that zeros in the final result of numbers are often ignored. So this 92 sort of piles onto this 902. A numerologist would view these in the same method. Now, I mentioned Bob Knight a little bit in my last video, where I talked about some of the synchronicity in relation to other news events. The last couple videos on this channel talked about the death of Matthew Perry, the famous actor from Friends, who referred to himself many times as Matman in the weeks leading up to his tragedy. And of course, this is a take on Batman, whose nickname is famously the Dark Knight. So we had eyes on this Knight riddle. And Bobby Knight doesn't just have this last name, but the first team he coached for during his career as a head coach was for the Army Black Knights. He spent nearly 30 years coaching for Indiana. And back in the 1980s, a film about high school basketball in Indiana was released called Hoosiers. And what's so interesting about Hoosiers is that the home games in that film were filmed in a gymnasium in Knightstown, Indiana. This is where the home team in that movie played, Knightstown. And Knightstown is a town in Wayne Township. And think about this in regards to the name Wayne Knight, who was an actor from another very popular sitcom from the 90s, Seinfeld, which was sort of a rival of Friends, the show that Matthew Perry starred on. Furthermore, the WWE also had an element of this Knight riddle, as rising superstar LA Knight took on Roman Reigns at Crown Jewel in Saudi Arabia this past weekend, of course losing. Reigns has been the champion for something like 3 years now. So a lot of syncs with Knight lately, and what I notice is that when you write out Batman the Dark Knight, you get the same gematria as Indiana Hoosiers and Indiana University. And we'll talk about how Bob Knight handing the reins to his son Pat Knight is a riddle connected to the Dark Knight and the Batman shooting, which occurred at the debut of The Dark Knight Rises in 2012. But first, I want to talk a little bit about Mars, because when you think about the name Knight, you tend to think of a soldier. And of course, the Roman god Mars is primarily, first and foremost, the god of war. Bob Knight was born on October 25th and died on November 1st. Now, both of those dates fall under the sign of Scorpio, and the planetary ruler of Scorpio is the planet Mars. Measuring from the date of the Dark Knight shooting, which was on the debut date of The Dark Knight Rises, to the death of Bob Knight was exactly 6 Martian years. That's right, 6 orbits for the planet Mars, which is about 687 days. Exactly 6 Martian years later, Bob Knight dies. Notice how Mars has the same ordinal gematria as Army, 51 and 57. Well, the word Rome and moon also have this gematria of 51 and 57. Rome was founded in the year 753 BC. And on the date of the 9/11 attacks, which was an act of war which started many wars in the Middle East, Bob Knight was exactly 753 lunar phases old. And that is, of course, a measurement of the moon. Moon even has gematria of 754 in one of our mathematical methods. So there's a strong sync here, but what I also want to touch on is this eclipse riddle. Bob Knight died at the age of 83, like head coach in Latin. In ancient Hebrew gematria, both total eclipse and solar eclipse are 83, like moon in English. And of course, we've been talking about these great American eclipses, as Yale just celebrated its 322nd anniversary, the home of Skull and Bones. And we have the cross being stamped over the United States with these 2 total solar eclipse paths. Well, Yale University equals 83, and the school was founded on the date leaving 83 days in the year. Bob Knight coached most of his career in Bloomington, Indiana, at Indiana University, and notice how that school sits directly in the path of the 2024 total solar eclipse. The other 2 head coaching jobs he had were in the states of New York and Texas. And the eclipse enters through Texas and then exits the United States right around New York, up there in the Northeast. So his entire career has been coated with these eclipses, and this makes sense. In reduction, the name night sums to 33. So does the word eclipse, 33. In fact, in ordinal, both night and eclipse are 69 as well. Bob Knight died 33 days before the anniversary of his coaching debut, all the way back in 1965. If you measure to the 2024 Great American Eclipse, to the date of his death, you get a span of 160 days. And in the alphabetic order, Indiana Hoosiers equals 160. With capital letters, solar eclipse also 160. And of course, it's important to understand we're still using the alphabetic order. Now, of course, in the English language, we have capital letters. So we need to understand that capital letters are taken into account in Gematria as well. In that same capital cipher, notice how Hoosiers has double Gematria of 134? Well, that's the ordinal value of solar eclipse. But check this out. Bloomington, Indiana, when abbreviated, has ordinal Gematria of 159. Without the end date, Bob Knight died 159 days before that eclipse, and his death occurred in the city of Bloomington, Indiana. Furthermore, his death also occurred a span of exactly 15 years and 9 months after his final game as a head coach in college basketball, which was back on February 2nd of 2008 against the Oklahoma State Sooners. On top of that, this eclipse is 5,910 days after his last game, the same digits. In Gematria, the World Trade Center equals 1590 Latin, and September 11th equals 1590 in reverse Sumerian. And there's a huge 9/11 riddle, as we will discover in this as well. The word basketball has Gematria of 251 in Latin Gematria. This famous basketball coach died 22 years and 51 days after 9/11. This 251 is also reflected in his birthday, the 25th of October, which can be written 25/10. Bob Knight's date of birth had reduced numerology of 22 when you add all of the digits together. This is a master number. Think about how master equals 22. Master builder number equals 220, and 22 is the master builder number. Well, basketball also equals 22 in standard reduction. Bob Knight was born during Brown lunation number 220. Every new moon has been numbered since January of 1923, and Bob Knight born during the 220th, which represents 22. And if you measure from the first game he coached at Army to the last game he coached at Texas Tech, it was exactly 2,200 weeks. Skull and Bones 202, The Brotherhood of Death 220. Consider also how Bob Knight died 20 weeks and 2 days after the Vegas Golden Knights won the Stanley Cup for the first time. And the number 202 is the ordinal Gematria of total solar eclipse, which is the root of this riddle. In reduction, total solar eclipse equals 67. Now, Bob Knight's last game was on February 2nd, or 202. And that game, the Red Raiders of Texas Tech won with 67 points. Well, in reduction, total solar eclipse equals 67. Bob Knight's birthday, October 25th, that's the date that leaves 67 days on the calendar. And when he retired, Bob Knight was 67 years old. When you measure from Bob's birthday to the birthday of his son Pat, you get the 67th prime number, 331 days. Now, back in the year 2001, the same year as the 9/11 attacks, on the date the 11th in May, a film called A Knight's Tale was released, and this was about a year after Bob Knight retired. On the date of that film's release, Pat Knight was 11,190 days old. So 9/11 digits here. And if you measure from that film to the death of his father, Bob, you get 8,210 days. Well, here we have the number 821. 821 like the date of the first Great American Eclipse over the United States. Bob Knight died exactly 821 weeks after the first game that his son Pat coached, which was on February 6th, the very next game for Texas Tech in the year 2008. With capital letters in reverse, notice how the name Pat Knight equals 189 and 272. Well, Bob Knight died a span of exactly 189 months after his last game, and also 272 days after the anniversary of that game. So let's think about this in regards to The Dark Knight. In Gematria, The Dark Knight Rises, which was the name of the 2012 film during which the Batman shooting occurred, this has Gematria of 656 and 926. Well, these digits are very similar to Bob Knight's age on the date of that release. Exactly 959 sidereal months, or lunar orbits. A sidereal month measures an orbit of the moon in relation to the stars. A little over 27 days. So that's a couple days less than a lunar phase, which measures from new moon to new moon. But not only was he 959 sidereal months old, but his son Pat was 9 months and 29 days after his birthday. The shooter at the Batman shooting was James Holmes, whose name sums to 929, like United States of America. The Dark Knight Rises in ordinal gematria has values of 206 and 280. 206 and 280. Well, Pat Knight's first game as the coach of the Red Raiders was on 206 of 2008. Notice how Texas Tech Red Raiders also has this 206 gematria. 28, a number connected to the eclipse code in Hebrew. Bob Knight's full name equals the 208th prime number. And notice how these digits, 283, sync up with the moon, total solar eclipse, and 666. The World Trade Center was 110 stories tall, and it had a 110-meter antenna on the North Tower. The number 11 was huge in 9/11. This is another number connected to Skull and Bones. And remember, after 9/11, we had the Skull and Bones election between George Bush and John Kerry, two members of the same secret society. So let's talk a little bit about this number 11, because Bob Knight's death fell 11 days before two of his former teams play each other. Indiana visits Army on November 12th, 11 days after his death. When Bob Knight died, it was exactly 1,010 months after the start of World War II. And think about how World War II has the digits II, a lot like 11. America's involvement in World War II became official after it was attacked by Japan, and the name Yoko Ono equals 1010. Now, this is relevant because Yoko Ono is, of course, the widow of John Lennon. And just less than one day after Bob Knight died, the Beatles released their final single, Now and Then. And we'll decode this later on in the video. But think about how the Japanese flag has the red dot. And the red dot in the sky is Mars, which we talked about earlier. And Bob Knight coached the Texas Tech Red Raiders after coaching Indiana, whose primary color is red. And before I forget with this 9/11 code, look at how many losses and wins Indiana currently has. Now, they haven't yet played their first game of the season. That takes place later today. So when Bob Knight died, this was their all-time record. 1909 and 1106. So here we have an upside-down 9/11, and then we have the same digits in 9/11. Red Raiders sums to 101 in ordinal. Bob Knight's final game with the Red Raiders was a span of 101 days after his birthday, and he was replaced by his son Pat Knight, who was born on the 101st day of the year. In reverse, Knights equals 101, a number connected to Skull and Bones. Also, when Bob Knight handed the reins over to his son, it was during Brown Lunation 1052. Texas Tech Red Raiders equals 1520. So another example of how the moon is important to Bob Knight. Indiana begins its 124th season of basketball today. In standard gematria, Indiana equals 124. Bob Knight's first ever game coaching for Army was on December 4th, or 12/4. And consider also how December 4th is the date of the most recent total solar eclipse back in 2021. Now, measuring from the date of that eclipse to the death of Bob Knight was 99 weeks and 4 days. And in this same standard gematria cipher, which is again identical to the Hebrew and Greek charts that we found in our ancient Phoenician and Semitic languages, total solar eclipse equals 994. The year 1994 will be of focus as we go. There's more 9/11 riddles here, though. The number 156 is, of course, significant because the number 9/11 is the 156th prime number. And eclipses always occur 1, 5, or 6 lunar phases apart. Bob Knight was 1,560 weeks old when his son Pat was born. Notice how the name Knight sums to 119. Of course, Yale University, headquartered in New Haven, 1019. Yale graduate George Bush was the president during 9/11. Pat Knight was born on a date with primary numerology of 119, and his full name sums to an upside-down 9/11. Bob Knight died exactly 1 year and 19 weeks before the next total lunar eclipse. And when he died, he was also 1,109 sidereal months old. Now, using capital letters, the capitals added method, the World Trade Center has gematria of 322. And consider how Yale University, home of the Skull and Bones Society, just turned 322 years old last month in October. Skull and Crossbones in ordinal is 222, or 3. 223. So when Bob Knight died, he was 30,322 days old. And his birthday was 322 days before the 9/11 attacks. Also, if you look at the date that he began coaching for Army, all the way back in 1965, notice how that has now been 3,022 weeks ago. So he died on the 1st, which was the 3,022nd week since he began coaching. Notice how Indiana Hoosiers has matching gematria with Skull and Bones Society, so does Indiana University. But this is where I'll end this story and go on to the next one. In our two main extended methods, Skull and Bones sums to 572 and 752. When Bob Knight coached his final game, he was 24,572 days old. And then he died 5,752 days later. His son Pat Knight was born 1,752 days after Bob Knight's first coaching job. Digits found in Yale University, Texas Tech Red Raiders, total solar eclipse. But finally, I want to point out that Bob Knight was born in 1940. These are the same digits in September 11th and 2001 in ordinal. Also, the number 119, when you write it out, sums to 194. Pat Knight was exactly 19,400 days old when his dad died. It was 194 lunar phases after his last game. And when he retired, it was 194 months before that eclipse over Bloomington. More connections as well, but definitely a strong 9/11 riddle with the death of Bob Knight. And this will be a theme as we continue our decodes. Next up, I want to talk about the Pittsburgh Steelers, who, as you will notice, now have a franchise record containing 666 wins in their history. Now, what's so interesting about this is that if you saw my Superstream last week, Superstream number 62, I talked about the death of ice hockey player Adam Johnson, who used to play for the Pittsburgh Penguins. And this is part of that whole Batman theme that we've been talking about with Matthew Perry. He died on the same date that Matthew Perry died. And in Batman, one of the arch villains is the Penguin. So we have this former Penguins player dying after his throat was slashed by an ice skate. And in this post on Adam Johnson, I have an entire section on the number 666. Penguins 66, Grand Rapids, where he was born, 666. He scored his only goal during Lunation 1197, which syncs up with 666. So this was huge. He even wore number 47 like Beast. So then the next game that his hometown NFL team plays, I shouldn't say hometown, but, Pittsburgh, the NHL team he played for. And remember, when he got his throat slashed, it was against a player from the Sheffield Steelers, right? So, an ice skate is made of steel. So, the very next game that the Pittsburgh Steelers play, they get their 666th win. What are the odds, right? This game was played on the 2nd of November, or 2/11. 666 equals 2/11. And you may remember this from the video. Adam Johnson died exactly 211 weeks after his only NHL goal. And in Gematria, 666 equals 2/11. 2/11, the 47th prime number, which syncs up with his jersey number. 666 is revealed as the number of the beast in the book of Revelation, which is written by John of Patmos. And think about how John has matching 47 Gematria with beast. Batman 666, Penguins 666. This number was even attributed in the score of the game that the Steelers won. Notice how they won by a score of 20-16, like 216. Well, if you multiply 6 times 6 times 6, you get a product of 216. In Gematria, Tennessee Titans equals 216. This is also a total of 36 points. The number 666 is not only made up of 3 sixes, but is also the 36th triangular number. And the Pittsburgh Steelers, for the record, also have 36 playoff wins on this very date. Meanwhile, the Tennessee Titans picked up their 495th loss in franchise history. They have a head coach named Michael George Vrabel, whose name equals 495 using prime numbers. Prime numbers still uses the alphabetic order, but applies only prime numbers to the cipher. This is one of those mathematical ciphers we use. Pittsburgh Steelers, also 495, with Fibonacci numbers. And remember, this was connected to the death of Matthew Langford Perry, the actor, whose name sums to 495. The quarterback of the Pittsburgh Steelers is Kenny Pickett, and notice how Kenny has Latin gematria of 495. Kenny Pickett was born in Ocean Township, New Jersey. And this is interesting, actually, because Ocean Township, New Jersey is also where Wendy Williams grew up. And I bring this up because back in 2017, Wendy Williams dressed up as the Statue of Liberty before passing out on live television. And if you guys never saw this, this is like literally one of the creepiest things I've ever seen, where she suddenly like blacks out. It looks like she sees a ghost or something and then just straight up collapses. Well, Matthew Perry died on the anniversary of the Statue of Liberty opening. And I talked about this in my video because the numbers 11 and 7 were huge. Statue of Liberty with a 7-pointed crown, 11-pointed base. Well, notice how Wendy Williams was 711 months and 11 days old when Matthew Perry died. Perry was born 1107 sidereal months after the statue opened. He was 11,711 days old on 9/11. Now, the name Williams is also relevant because William was the name of the other quarterback in this game for the Titans, Will Levis. Now, Will Levis was born in Newton, Massachusetts. And would you believe that Newton, Massachusetts is also the birthplace of the other Matt from Friends, Matt LeBlanc, born in Newton, Massachusetts. Now, this is also important because on my channel, I did the video on the Lewiston, Maine shootings, which was connected to Sandy Hook. Sandy Hook, of course, in Newtown, Connecticut. So just another connection to the overall theme in the media recently. So we'll talk about Will Levis in a second, but first I want to focus on Kenny Pickett, as this guy is a walking 666 riddle. Notice how his name sums to 1332 in standard gematria. Well, 1332 is the first multiple of 666. Notice how his birthday is 6/6, June 6th, and he was born in 1998. Well, 1998 is the third multiple of 666. Notice how the name Kenny equals 69 and 66, similar to the digits in Matthew Perry, Matthew LeBlanc connected, 90 and 99 like the moon. Speaking of 90 and 99, Will Levis was born in 1999, which has the upside-down 666. And like I mentioned, he was born in the same city as Matt LeBlanc, but check this out. In Latin gematria, Newton, Massachusetts equals 1166. And if you measure from the birthday of Matt LeBlanc to the birthday of fellow Newton resident Will Levis, they were born 11,660 days apart, matching the gematria of the birthplace they share. What a script. Sometimes it's just amazing, right? In fact, Matt LeBlanc was 696 lunar phases old on the date of this game, exactly. Will Levis was born one day before Matt LeBlanc turned 1,666 weeks old. Their birthdays were also separated by 337 days, which is the 68th prime number. Both Levis and Matt LeBlanc share 68 gematria. But if you just look at these two quarterbacks, Kenny Pickett and Will Levis, who, by the way, just recently stepped in for an injured player, probably for this game. These two quarterbacks were born 1 year and 3 weeks apart, exactly, just like 666 in gematria. Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Steelers, Matt LeBlanc, all 103. In fact, Matt LeBlanc also equals 194, and Will Levis was born 10,904 days after Matthew Perry. Will Levis was also 238 days before his birthday, which stood out because Adam Johnson, the hockey player, died 238 days before his birthday, and he used to play for Pittsburgh. Notice how Pittsburgh and state of Pennsylvania both have gematria of 238, just like 666 and Adam, just like Grand Rapids, his birthplace. The name Matthew Perry is a supermatch with Pennsylvania. And Matthew Perry died on the same date as a lunar eclipse from Saros 146. Well, in Latin gematria, Pennsylvania equals 1406. So without question, all of these Pennsylvania connections, the death of Adam Johnson, the Steelers getting their 666th win, it's all synced up together. And this is on a mystical level, guys. I mean, again, I urge you not to watch it for your own fucking sake, but Adam Johnson really did get killed by an ice skate on the rink. Nobody staged it. Nobody set it up. You couldn't have staged something like that. The way it happened was such a freak accident. The number 322 also stood out because Matt LeBlanc, his name sums to 322 in Latin, and he was born 322 months before the ice hockey player who died. Meanwhile, the coach of the Pittsburgh Steelers, whose name is Mike, just like the coach of the Titans, Mike Vrabel, the name Michael Petaway Tomlin has gematria of 322 in reverse. And you may recall, I did a post earlier this season about a huge skull and bones riddle with Mike Tomlin and the Raiders. Of course, the Raiders have one of the skull and bones logos there in the NFL. Skull and Bones was founded in the year 1832. And notice how Adam Johnson was born 1,832 days before Will Levis. This is also 60 months and 6 days. And Skull and Bones is a supermatch with 66 in gematria. 66 also the product of 3 times 22. So I wouldn't suggest that this Skull and Bones code is organic. If I hadn't had tragedy in my own life connected to this code. If you want more information on that and how I've been waking up to the organic matrix over the years as I've taught this language, check out Superstream number, 51, where I talked about the organic synchronicities with the death of my cousin, who passed away from a drug overdose back in April. Of course, her name was April. But yeah, I mean, a lot of people have been asking me lately, what I think of what's going on with these synchronicities. How is this all possible? Who's responsible for this? And I'm telling you guys, it ain't a who. At least not things like this. Now, I'll be the first to tell you that the media runs news stories by the numbers. And they may even be rigging some sports games by the numbers. To the extent to which that occurs, I'm not sure. But this is too deep for only humans to be doing. And, I talk a lot about Revelation, 666, the number of the beast. Honest to God, I think we are in a period of revelation. And that may sound scary to some people, but it's God, it's the Creator revealing himself to the creations. Because, look, when you look at the world around us, God is slipping away from the mainstream idea of what we should be doing in this world and how we should be living our lives. And as that gets worse and worse, the good side, the spiritual positives, are going to get better and better. And those who have eyes to see, who refuse the programming from the Matrix, I suppose you could say, they will receive light at a higher rate, a higher pace than those before them. It's a deep topic and one I may devote more time to in the near future. But again, when someone dies on the ice and you can watch the video of it happen and it's clearly a freak accident, that should be a signal to you that there is something deeper going on. And all I'm saying is that deeper sense of numerology, that organic connection, actually does extend to celebrities, to professional sports. I did a decode on a wiffle ball game last year. Like, why would a wiffle ball game be by the numbers? Is the occult staging those? No, it's ridiculous. And I could even get deeper into this. This whole Steele riddle with Adam Johnson dying while he played for Nottingham. I actually have a personal sync with this too that I'm not going to get into, but I once created a fictional character from Nottingham whose last name was Steele. And yes, the numbers lined up with this event. So I know what's happening on this level, and all I'm trying to do is get other people who have woken up to Gematria through various methods to this side, which is that it's not all scary. It's not all terrifying. Like, yes, there's death involved, but because these things are so strongly aligned, they must have been destined to occur. Whether it was a creator, whether it was a separate entity from human beings themselves. I can't say for sure. I'm one of you guys too, but without question, I mean, we are picking up on something that is truly, truly amazing, phenomenal in our world. And it's no question why Gematria channels such as this one have been stomped on, because, and when I say that, I mean, YouTube changing their entire algorithm once my videos started to go viral on their platform. They don't want people to see this because understanding more about the world we live in is empowering. And yeah, as long as you stay positive and aware, yes, we will survive. We will survive to move on from this plane, of course. All right, so seeing as we're talking about the NFL and pro sports, on Sunday, we had our candidate for NFL's Game of the Year with the Texans' 39-37 win over the Buccaneers. Now, last year, I made this post on the Game of the Year between the Vikings and Bills, and indeed, this game did go on to win Game of the Year, according to Fox Sports and some other outlets. And this was entirely by the numbers. And what's so crazy about this is that last year's Game of the Year finished with a score of 33-30. This year's Game of the Year also had a 33-30 score. And at that time, that's when the play of the game occurred, because the big story from this game is that Texas had to use their emergency kicker. And I want to point out that, this was the Houston Texans. This was just days after the Texas Rangers won their first ever World Series. So there's a strong sync here. Now, when he kicked this field goal, the score was 33-30. And it just so happens that this running back wears number 33. So immediately I realized this was another strong numeric synchronicity that was well worth decoding. So let's get into this, right? 39 points is what the Texans ended up winning, or scoring to win this game. In Gematria, both Houston, Texas, and Eclipse has Gematria of 39. Houston, Texas also 309. And think about their kicker, Kaimi Fairbairn, giving way to Dare Ogunbowale. Well, Kaimi Fairbairn equals 309, and so does Ogunbowale. The new head coach of the Houston Texans this year is DeMeco Ryans. Notice how DeMeco Ryans was 39 years, 3 months, and 3 days old for this game. Ryans was hired earlier this year on a date with numerology of 39, and this game was 39 weeks later. But again, this is all about the eclipse that passes over the state of Texas, where this football game was played on Sunday. That eclipse falls on the 99th day of a leap year. The United States of America and America both have 99 Gematria. Well, so does Oluwadare Dare Ogunbowale, which is my new favorite NFL name to say. His name equals 99. And the kicker he replaced, John Christian Kaim... Shit. Well, his full name also has gematria of the 99th prime number in the alphabetic order. And yes, I guess that is his real middle name. Holy smokes, I'm glad I'm not Hawaiian, asking people to say that. These two men also share 235 gematria, which has those same digits. Ogunbowale also has matching 69 gematria with Eclipse, Texas, and Houston Texans. But check this out. Houston has gematria of 778. In ancient Greek isopsephy, the word for eclipse sums to 778. In that same standard method, block the sun equals 778. Well, on the date of this game, Ogunbowale, for his heroics, was 10,778 days old. Now, Ogunbowale was born in 1994. Kaimi Fairbairn, who he replaced, was born in 1994. And think about how this connects to the Rangers, right, through Texas. The Rangers' World Series MVP was Corey Seager, who was also born in 1994. Again, this being the big total solar eclipse number, 994. The names Fairbairn and Ogunbowale, these two kicking Texans, both have gematria of 155. This game was played 155 days before the Great American Eclipse over Texas, but this is also 156 days with the end date included. You may recall this from before, Eclipse 156, just like Eclipse the Sun. Both Houston, Texas, when abbreviated, and Houston Texans has gematria of 156. They were hosting Tampa Bay 156. 156 is also the gematria of 33, which is the number that Ogunbowale now wears for the Texans. On the date of that next eclipse, he'll be 10,933 days old. The word eclipse equals 33. So does the state of Hawaii, which is where the Texans kicker was born, this being the man who got injured. The phrase emergency kicker also has 303 gematria. And think about how both Houston and Tampa Bay entered this game with 3 wins apiece. The score was 30-30 when this field goal was kicked. And it was good. It went through the uprights, giving Texas 33 points for the game. And you have to appreciate that Buccaneers Texans has matching gematria with 33 in standard. In the Bible's 33rd verse, God rests on the 7th day. Both 1 week and 7 days equals 33. Well, Ogunbowale was born exactly 1 week or 7 days after Corey Seager, the Texas Rangers MVP of the World Series. And the name Seager has this 33 gematria with Sumerian. For the record, Sumerian gematria is the alphabetic order times 6. Corey Seager has 54 birth numerology connected to baseball, which has double gematria of 54. Ogunbowale born on May 4th, or 5-4. And notice how Ogunbowale has matching 696 gematria with the full names of both Corey Seager and Kaimi Fairbairn. Also, all of these guys are 29 years old. And it just so happens that Ogunbowale's field goal was 29 yards. Kaimi Fairbairn has matching 121 gematria with Corey Seager. This game was 12 weeks and 1 day after his birthday. Fairbairn was born 12 weeks and 5 days before Seager's birthday. The name John Fairbairn, his real name, 125. Meanwhile, Corey Seager was 5 months and 22 days after his birthday. And the reason Fairbairn left was because of a quadriceps injury in Houston, Texas, which both summed to 522. Well, the final score of this game read 37-39, and that's the 522nd prime number. So, strong connections there. But there's more syncs between these two kickers. Both Ogunbowale and Buccaneers equals 181. He was 181 days after his birthday. Houston, Texas equals 181. But also 1,034. And Ogunbowale born 13 weeks and 4 days after Kaimi Fairbairn. Those are the same digits in Houston, Texas reverse. Both of these men with gematria of 143. John Fairbairn with 143 birth numerology. So, a lot of numeric connections here with this game, but really it's centered around 33, 156 days before the eclipse, which is the gematria of 33. It just doesn't get much more clear than this. All right, so next up, let's talk about the World Series. This year being the 119th edition of the World Series, and this is the huge riddle with this year. Remember, after the 9/11 attacks, the 2001 World Series was won by the Arizona Diamondbacks, who have not appeared in the Fall Classic until this year, 2023. Now, what's interesting is that if you look at the number of days in 2023 weeks, notice how this number is 119 squared. And here we have the 119th World Series in the year 2023. So, of course, there's going to be a massive connection to 2001. And that's what this decode is going to be all about, showing you guys how it's basically a recreation of the 2001 World Series. This year, Rangers Diamondbacks equals 119. No mistake there. Now, the Texas Rangers never won the World Series before. This team used to be owned by former President George W. Bush, who became the governor of Texas and then later the president. George Bush is currently 77 years old, just like September 11th and World Trade Center in Gematria. And when the Rangers won the 119th World Series, George Bush was 119 days after his birthday. George Bush's birthday falls 9 months, 11 days before Bruce Bochy's birthday. Bochy, the head coach of the Texas Rangers. When the Rangers won, the pitcher on the mound was Josh Sborz, who got the save for the game. And notice how Josh Sborz was 10,911 days old. And his full name has this 77, which we saw synced up with George Bush. And just think about these managers. Bruce Bochy winning the 2023 World Series, whereas the 2001 World Series was won by Bob Brenly, the same BB initials. In 2001, the losing manager was Joe Torre. In 2023, the losing manager was Torre Lavulo. Now, Bruce Bochy, he is no stranger to success, as he coached the San Francisco Giants to 3 World Series championships. The San Francisco Giants are the same team that Bob Brenly spent his entire playing career with, aside from about 50 games in 1989. So, of course, Bruce Bochy, Bob Brenly, they're going to be connected through this San Francisco riddle. Now, the primary dialing code in San Francisco is 415. Furthermore, San Francisco was founded on April 15th, or 415. Measuring from the birthdays of Bob Brenly to Bruce Bochy is 415 days. Their birthdays are also 1 month, 22 days apart. San Francisco equals 122, and the city sits on the 122nd meridian. On the date of the 9/11 attacks, Bob Brenly was 199 days after his birthday. Bruce Bochy won the World Series, the 119th World Series, 199 days after his birthday. The Twin Towers equals 199. World Series equals 199. Joseph Paul Torre, the former Yankees manager who would go on to become, was he commissioner or like a chairman of baseball or something like that? His name also 199. And check out how the full names, Robert Earl Brenly, Bruce Douglas Bochy, Joseph Paul Torre, all 82, just like Rangers and Bochy. Torre's full name also equals 80, just like Yankees. Well, the name Lovulo is a super match with Yankees in Gematria. And, of course, this guy named Torre, just like the former Yankees manager Joe Torre. Torre Lovulo was born on the 206th day of the year, which had numerology of 97. Joseph Paul Torre, 206 reverse, and Joe Torre, 970 in Latin, matching Robert Earl Brenly, the manager he faced in the World Series. And when they squared off, it was the 97th edition of the World Series. Both managers with that 97 in Latin. Joe Torre was born on the 18th of July, like 187. New York Yankees equals 187. George Bush born on the 187th day of the year. Well, the last name Lovulo, also 187, but also 251. 25 years and 1 week separate the birthdays of Joe Torre and Torre Lovulo. Remember, this was the basketball number connected to Bob Knight. The Rangers winning the World Series on the same date that Bob Knight died, 22 years and 51 days after 9/11. Torre Lovulo was born in the year 1965. Torre Lovulo equals 1965 in standard Gematria. And his date of birth was the 25th of July, or 25/7. And his birthday was 25 years and 7 days after Joe Torre's. This 257 is the 55th prime number. In 2001, the Diamondbacks won that World Series 55 days after the 9/11 attacks. George Bush was 55 years old in 2001. This year's World Series ended on a date with primary numerology of 55. The pitcher on the mound at the end, Spores equals 55, and the MVP, Seager, equals 55. Now, what's interesting is that this series ended in Game 5. And to open up Game 5, the woman who sang the national anthem was a member of Fifth Harmony, like the number 5. And notice how Dinah Jane has 5 names. Dinah Jane Malika Ilisane Hansen. I shouldn't have started pronouncing that name because I got to the 4th one. And I was like, whoa, what am I doing? In over my head. So notice how her full name, all 5 of them, have Latin Gematria of 1147. This is like 147 found in National Anthem. World Series also 147. And isn't it funny that Josh Spores, the pitcher on the mound at the end, he's from Washington, D.C., where George Bush spent his presidency. Josh Spores has matching 1470 Gematria with George Walker Bush in Latin. The Star-Spangled Banner was written by Francis Scott Key. And Francis Scott Key was born in the year 1779. Notice how the Star-Spangled Banner in Latin sums to 779. On the date of this game, Game 5, Torey Lavulo, the losing manager, was exactly 779 sidereal months old. Now, if you crack open the alphabetic order, the Star-Spangled Banner equals 223, just like this year. And in reverse reduction, the Star-Spangled Banner equals 119. And here we are in the 119th World Series. The name Joshua Allen Spores, his full name, 223. And the final out thrown by Spores was made by Ketel Marte, whose name sums to 2203. Also, there's 223 days before the birthdays of Bob Brenly and Joe Torre. That stood out because Joe Torre's full name equals the 223rd prime number. Notice how Joe Torre was 2,180 days older than George Bush. This is an interesting number because the World Trade Center and Twin Towers both equal 218. Ketel Marte and Joe Torre both equal 218 with capital letters. And Joe Torre was born in 1940, just like Bob Knight, September 11th, 2001, and 119, all 194. The name Joe Torre has matching 110 Gematria with Arizona, and he lost to Arizona in 2001, a span of 110 days after his birthday. And here we go again with the 110, a huge number in the 9/11 attacks. Texas plays its home games in Arlington, 110. But notice how the two managers in this year's World Series, they were born 10 years, 100 days apart. Including the end date, it's 10 years and 101 days, like 111. Well, November 1st, 111 was the date that the series ended. The name Josh Spores equals 111. So does Arizona in standard. Recall the World Trade Center was destroyed on the date leaving 111 days in the year. World Trade Center with the 111 in Sumerian. The Brown lunation number, 1,247 for the Rangers win. That's also found in the reverse gematria of World Trade Center 247. Torey Lavulo has an upside-down 911 in his birth numerology, and his last name equals 109 and 910. Well, notice how he was born a span of 19 years and 20 days after George Bush, and the name Torey Lavulo equals 192. Joe Torre equals 106. This year's World Series ended 106 days after Torrey's birthday. Bruce Bochy celebrates his birthday on the 106th day of the year. The World Trade Center, Star-Spangled Banner, Spores, Lavulo, all 106 in Gematria. It feels like I'm moving a little fast with this one, but there's just so much to cover. And for this next part, what I want to focus on is the big connection with the 2001 MVPs. So in 2001, we had co-MVPs. Pitchers Randy Johnson and Curt Schilling were both called Most Valuable Player. And there's a huge Twin Towers riddle with this. And what I want to actually find out is Curt Schilling's height. Yeah, Curt Schilling is 6'5", which it's not like super tall for a pitcher, but it's kind of tall, right? Well, Randy Johnson was literally the tallest player in Major League history. And think about 2001, right? The Twin Towers. It's interesting that you have two tall pitchers as MVP. And this all came to a head in Game 7 because the game was started by Curt Schilling and finished by Randy Johnson. So Strong links with these two pitchers. They were definitely the biggest figures in Arizona's win. Now, if you measure between the birthdays of Randy Johnson and Curt Schilling, you get exactly a span of 166 weeks. These two men were essentially the twin towers, 166 in ordinal. And their birthdays are also 1,161 days apart. And that looks a lot like the date September 11th of 01, doesn't it? The name Randy Johnson equals 1403. Well, this year, in the clinching game, Game 5, the winning pitcher was Nathan Eovaldi, and the saving pitcher was Josh Sborz. Well, those two men were born 1,403 days apart, matching the gematria of Randy Johnson. Nathan Eovaldi's full name sums to 1973. The World Trade Center opened in the year 1973. Eovaldi was also 3 years and 307 days older than Josh Sborz. World Trade Center equals 1337. New York City equals 2337. Meanwhile, the losing pitcher of this game was Zach Gallen, the losing pitcher. Well, notice how Zach Gallen was born 1,997 days after the winning pitcher. And in Latin, New York City equals 1997. New York City, New York equals 279 in ordinal. Curt Schilling's full name, Curtis Montague Schilling, also equals 279. This year's winning pitcher, Nathan Eovaldi, was born exactly 279 months after Curt Schilling. Curt Schilling, his birthday also falls 33 days before Josh Sborz. Now, their birthdays are also separated by 9,895 days. Well, 895 is the Latin gematria of 33. 33 also sums to 156. Randy Johnson, his birthday falls 156 days before Nathan Eovaldi's, and Josh Sborz was born 11,056 days after Randy Johnson. And of course, the 156th prime number is 911. So, the World Series ended just a few days after Matthew Perry died, and in my video on Perry, I talked a little bit about this big water riddle, because it was all connected to Jim Morrison, who died under the sign of Cancer, which is a water sign. And then Matthew Perry died under Scorpio, which is a water sign. Matthew Perry's mother's name was Morrison, connecting him to Jim, both of them drowning or being found dead in water. And of course, the moon and water, coated together. Well, in 2001, the losing pitcher was Mariano Rivera. And Rivera, of course, meaning river. Well, this year, the losing pitcher was named Gallon. And think about how water is measured in gallons. I mentioned the number 247 earlier. Well, Zach Gallen, his birthday falls 247 days after Mariano Rivera's, but also 119 days before his next. There's some more 33 and 666 here. I feel like I probably mentioned enough. The losing pitcher, Zach Gallen, he was also 10,318 days old. And of course, 666 revealed as the number of the beast in Revelation 13:18. So, a huge 2001 riddle. This is really one of my favorite syncs now of all time. Like, it definitely seems rigged, doesn't it? I guess we'll never find out. These guys are so tight-lipped. They'll never tell us the truth. All right, everyone. So the last decode for this video, I'm going to talk about the new Beatles song. Now, a couple stories ago, I talked about this connection between Will Levis and Matt LeBlanc. Both of these guys born in Newton. Now, when I saw this, I was thinking, are we going to see an apple riddle? Because when I think of Newton, I think of Isaac Newton, Newton's apple. Well, the Beatles were founders of Apple Records, and one day after the World Series, the Beatles released their final song called Now and Then. So in order to really understand the numerology here, I want to refer you to a couple of older posts I made. The Beatles are a riddle connected to the Catholic Church. Well, why is this, you ask? Well, the same year that John Lennon and Paul McCartney met, we got the first pope named Paul in like 300 years. The next pope after that was the first pope named John in over 500 years. And maybe I have that backwards. I think it was John and then Paul. And of course, the two main Beatles, John and Paul. Well, then the next pope after that was Pope John Paul. And that was the first pope to ever use a double name. Pope John Paul I died after 33 days as the pope. And of course, this is all connected to the death of John Lennon just 2 years later. The other big riddle with the Beatles is Steve Jobs, as he founded Apple, whereas the Beatles founded Apple Records. The numerological connections between the Beatles and Steve Jobs, particularly through John Lennon, are insane. Steve Jobs was born on 2/24, matching the Gematria of John Winston Lennon. And I think Jobs even died 224 days after his birthday or something. Steve Jobs died during Brown lunation 1098, the same digits in 1980, the year that John Lennon died. And Apple Inc. equals 198. But what's really crazy is that Steve Jobs died on October 5th, which is the anniversary of the first ever Beatles song, Love Me Do. And now, Love Me Do is the other side of their last single. So this last single has their first single as the B-side, essentially, bookending their careers, right? Stephen Paul Jobs equals 1963, which is the year that Beatlemania began. I mean, it's so crazy how these two guys are connected. Some of you may think they're the same person, but I think that's silly. They don't have to be the same person for there to be a massive riddle between them. And maybe they are related on some level. Another thing that connects this is that a couple years ago, there was this documentary called Get Back. And 9 months after that documentary was released, Pope John Paul I was beatified by the Catholic Church. Beatles. Beatification. There's a strong connection here. So I have an old post on that. This song, Now and Then, came out 1 year, 343 days after the Get Back documentary. Steve Jobs died exactly 30 years, 43 weeks after John Lennon died. John Lennon died on the 343rd day of the year. When Now and Then came out, John Lennon would have not only been 30,340 days old, but he would have also been 343 days before his next birthday. And in standard gematria, Beatles equals 343. One of the two surviving Beatles, Ringo Starr, was 30,433 days old when the song was released. And this all happened one day after the Rangers won their first World Series. Rangers equals 343. Now, 343 is 7 cubed. 7 times 7 times 7. And check out how Beatles Now and Then equals 777. Also, when Steve Jobs founded Apple, he was 7,707 days old. When the song Love Me Do was released back in 1962, Pope John Paul I was exactly 618 lunar phases old. John and Paul were born a span of 618 days apart, and Paul was born on 6/18, June 18th. Now and Then was released 137 days after McCartney's birthday. Both John Paul I and his real last name, Luciani, equals 137. But that's the 33rd prime number, like Luciani in reduction. And remember, Luciani died 33 days after becoming the Pope. When Steve Jobs died, it was exactly 33 years and 1 week after John Paul I died. And remember, both 1 week, 7 days equals 33. God rests on the 7th day in the 33rd verse of the Bible. John Paul I was the 263rd Pope, and 263 is the 56th prime number, like Pope in Gematria. Well, the Beatles equals 56, and they released their final song on a date with primary numerology of 56 in the year 2023. And in Latin Gematria, Beatles equals 223. When Steve Jobs died, he was 56 years, 223 days old. Now and Then was released 60 weeks and 4 days after the beatification of John Paul I. Beatles equals 64, so does Stephen Paul Jobs. Actually, I think Steve also 64. So this last song for the Beatles, the word last equals 211, and the last song was released on the 2nd of November, or 211. Now again, the other song on the single is Love Me Do, their first single. Paul McCartney was 20 years, 110 days old when that song was released. The Beatles' last album came out 211 days after Lennon's birthday. And remember, the year 2011 is when Steve Jobs died. Now, 211 is the 47th prime number. It's been 47 years since Steve Jobs founded Apple, but check this out, right? It's also been 571 months since Apple was founded. That's the 105th prime number. And Steve Jobs died on October 5th, 10/5. Well, if you add up all of the names of the Beatles, John Lennon, Paul McCartney, George Harrison, Ringo Starr, in ordinal, it sums to 571. So, in my post on the Beatles' birthdays, the 4 Beatles guitarists, all of their birthdays line up perfectly on the calendar. What do I mean by that? Well, the first member of the Beatles who left was Stuart Sutcliffe, who died shortly after. And he was born a span of 109 days before Lennon's 10/9 birthday. Lennon was born a span of 618 days before McCartney's 6/18 birthday. And then McCartney was born a span of 252 days before Harrison's 25/2 birthday. But in light of all of this, the number 114 is also super significant. Harrison was born 114 days before McCartney's birthday, and McCartney was born 114 days before Lennon's birthday. The first Beatle to die, Stuart Sutcliffe, his full name sums to 411. Well, the next year, or maybe it was the same year, but 1962, John Lennon invited Ringo Starr to join the group. And when he did that, Lennon was exactly 1,140 weeks old. Ringo Starr was born 1 year, 140 days before the first Beatles drummer, Pete Best. Pete Best was born 411 days after John Lennon's birthday on the date 24/11, which has another 411. So now we get the last Beatles song, which equals 1104. It's been exactly 1,144 weeks since the death of George Harrison and 4,411 days since the death of Steve Jobs. It's also 114 days before Steve Jobs' next birthday. And this song was released 10,104 days after the last Beatles single in 1996. And in Gematria, Beatles now and then equals 1411. John Lennon even died 114 weeks and 4 days after John Paul I. John Paul I is also connected to Steve Jobs. Think about how the Pope had a birthday of 1017, like 117. Steve Jobs equals 117 and 126. Well, Steve Jobs died 12,060 days after John Paul I. Furthermore, he was born 131 days after John Paul I's birthday. John Paul I became the Pope on a date with 131 numerology. And when he was beatified last year, it was exactly 131 months after the death of Steve Jobs. And I know there's a big Jobs riddle here because think about the name Jobs and how ironic that is, given that Apple sent so many jobs overseas. Well, now this new Beatles song also has a video with artificial intelligence, and I guess there was some AI used to create the song. Really, I think it was AI might be a weird term. It's just some machine learning to separate vocals from background, but either way, there's AI used in the video for the song. And think about how many people AI is supposed to put out of jobs, right? So there's definitely something deeper there, probably worth its own decode, but I just wanted to share the numerology of that. As, you know, this is the kind of thing where it's like, it's so undeniable that there's Gematria connections here that you'd have to be a fool to ignore it. But that's okay, because we live in a world full of many fools, unfortunately. None of which watch this channel, however. That I'm pretty confident of. But, yeah, guys, that's going to do it. That's the last decode on this video. Thanks to everybody for watching. If you made it through the whole video, you're a frickin' champion. I don't know how you do it. But that'll do it for this one. Peace, love, God bless. As always, check the description down below for more links, particularly if you'd like to support the work. We'll talk to you next time, everyone. See ya.